Newcastle had originally been the village for epileptics, and so you didn't necessarily have a cognitive disability if you were admitted to Newcastle. You had a seizure disorder. There were men and women that were separated across a valley. It was quite a large institution in that day. And so the men had to remain separated from the women. They didn't want anyone to have children or to, quote, pass on, pardon me, the seizure disorder. It would have been very large back when it first started around the turn of the century. There would have been a dairy farm. People worked the fields. There were crops that were planted. People worked in the buildings. People did the custodial work and never got paid for that. When I started in 1977, when people were admitted, they brought with them what was called their death bag. And that included the clothing that they wanted to be buried in, as well as their funeral arrangements. And so the thought was that if you were admitted to Newcastle, you stayed there until the day you died. And that was a real shock to me. The more I worked there, the more I realized that many of those individuals didn't need the custodial care that Newcastle provided, that they could have lived on the outside had there been proper supports and understanding of epilepsy. With Newcastle being the village for epileptics, that they had 2 full-time neurologists on staff, which is unheard of, or was unheard of past the mid-'80s. They were both older gentlemen, but they had obviously a lot of knowledge of epilepsy. And again, there was a laboratory there was a laboratory director, there were EEG technicians, and the drug studies for Depakote were also done at Newcastle. They used that population to do some drug studies. Newcastle, in their training for staff, and initially I worked in an epilepsy outpatient clinic, so we were seeing individuals that didn't have access to neurology care, and we had an EEG lab. We could run anticonvulsant levels, all of that. But one of the proudest things that Newcastle had was a training film, and it was spectacular. It showed different types of seizures, and it was very well done. But what they had done years later, knowing they had taken people off of their anticonvulsant medication who lived at Newcastle, no informed consent, no way about it. I'm sure they probably said to them, "Would you like to be on camera?" And they said, "Sure." But there hadn't been any of the research things that we, abide by now. And so while this film was fabulous, because you could see what a grand mal seizure looked like, pre and post, no one had given those individuals really much of a choice of their participation. And so there were children and adults that were literally thrown into seizure activity. It seemed to me that they had a lot of time just sitting or walking the grounds. And so there wasn't a lot for folks to do. There was an Associated Patient Services, which was a group of sheltered workshop type settings, but only a few people, made it into that. So the folks that weren't able to do some basic sorting or work type activities pretty much stayed on the units. There weren't many activities off grounds at all. This was also back when behavioralists were still using straitjackets, ammonia sprays, those types of things. And I still have memories of, we had one individual, I believe he's in a waiver now, who was smart enough to kind of get out of the straitjacket and escape, and so he would be running across grounds with, the straps kind of flapping. The ammonia sprays were used especially on the children's units, and I remember being appalled about that even then. But the psychologist, of course, would say, well, this is what is needed. But their days weren't not good. The units were overcrowded, quite frankly. If you wanted any privacy, there wasn't any way for you to have privacy. And that's probably why people walked the grounds or got out of the buildings when they could. It was a pretty bleak day for most people, even the children. And the units weren't very attractive either in the early days. I know that when I started, there were some individuals, some caseworkers that had a vision that people could live out in the community, and there was what was called the Family Care Program. They would they would recruit individuals that were willing to take folks into their homes in the community, or perhaps purchase homes and work with individuals in the community. And that was an interesting program. It seemed to work very well. The caretakers, if you will, ranged from little old ladies to there was a young couple in Modoc, Indiana that took children. And it was a great first step toward integrating folks, getting them out of, especially children, getting them out of an institutional setting and really being part of a family, of a community, and that sort of thing. And so I don't want to leave the impression that Newcastle wasn't, that it was only institutional, not doing anything right. There were some folks that had some futuristic types of visions and really worked hard to get some individuals out into the community.